rapist was paroled 6 years into a 30-year sentence, only to murder his victim on release. Charles Rodman Campbell craftily bided his time and played the good little inmate only to revert to type when he was set free. He'd originally been charged with forcing himself on Rennie Wickland, and for holding a knife to her 8-month-old baby while he raped her. She and her neighbor testified against him, and as a result he was put away for what should have been a lengthy sentence. Sadly, it was commuted for good behavior, and Washington agreed to let him loose. Unleashed, Campbell wasted no time in tracking Wickland down and slashing her child and a neighbor's throats in a reprisal for their original, damning testimonies. Charles Rodman Campbell was born on October 21, 1954 in Hawaii, U.S. His case highlights some of the legal controversy surrounding capital punishment in the United States. After the killings, police were told by a neighbor girl that she saw Campbell sneaking around Wickland's yard with a knife that morning, and other neighbors observed him heading towards their house with a large blanket roll in his hands. It was also obvious that Campbell's getaway from the crime scene was extremely sloppy, with no attempt to conceal anything. A bloody handprint was found on a drinking glass in the Wickland's kitchen that matched his fingerprints. And a trail of Rennie Wickland's jewelry was running from the front door of the house down the walkway. Campbell's car had dried blood on the driver's side door handle, and the earring of Shanna's was found in the back seat. A pair of earrings belonging to Rennie were found in Campbell's pants pockets when he was arrested. In addition, a fellow work-release resident directed police to a location along the banks of the Snohomish River, where he and Campbell had been on the evening of April 14th. Divers retrieved more jewelry and knickknacks taken from the Wicklands' home. When questioned by police, Hendrickson stated that the man who attacked Rennie 8 years before was the only possible perpetrator he could think of. Campbell was arrested at the Monroe Reformatory on April 19th, and charged with first-degree murder. Held in the Snohomish County Jail, he was unpopular with other prisoners, since he had murdered a child, and because the circumstances of his crime meant that stricter rules would be imposed on the freedoms of inmates on parole. Campbell was charged with the April 1982 killing of Rennie Wickland, her 8-year-old daughter Shanna, and her neighbor Barbara Hendrickson, in Cloverview, Snohomish County, Washington. He was convicted and sentenced to death. In 1982 he was convicted on charges of capital murder. Campbell had been given a choice between hanging and lethal injection, but refused to make a choice. So under state law, hanging was used. Later in 1996, Washington state law was amended to make lethal injection the default method. By 1984, the case had gone through the entire state court system, and the conviction and sentence was affirmed by the Washington State Supreme Court. He was sentenced to death on December 17, 1984. But appealed his conviction and sentence for 12 years, a total of 3 appeals. On November 7, 1988, the case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, which refused to hear the appeal. Afterwards, however, it was again appealed to the Supreme Court in 1993 by the state, which wished to conclude the case. There was debate over whether hanging was cruel and unusual punishment and thus unconstitutional. The state of Washington has found a hangman to execute a prisoner who walked away from a work-release program and killed a woman who testified against him after he had assaulted her 8 years earlier. Charles Rodman Campbell goes to the gallows. It is the first hanging in the United States since Kansas executed 4 men in 1965, including Richard Eugene Hiscock and Perry Edward Smith. The execution of Mr. Campbell, for the 1982 killings of Rennie Wickland, her daughter and a neighbor, would be Washington's first since June 1953. Hanging is Washington state's official form of execution, although a prisoner may choose to take a lethal injection of drugs. Mr. Campbell has refused to choose the injection method. Montana, Delaware and New Hampshire were the only other states where still designate hanging as their official form of execution during the time of Mr. Campbell's execution. None of the three has executed anyone in at least 40 years. There was difficulty finding an executioner, because hangings have been so rare in the United States. State Department of Corrections officials had difficulty finding a qualified executioner. The prison director, Larry Kinchelow, said the executioner was hired in the United States for $1,500. Corrections officials have kept the person's identity secret, which has prompted the American Civil Liberties Union to ask for public records to substantiate the executioner's credentials. A bill to make the lethal injection the sole method of execution in Washington was stalled in a legislative committee. In the appeal in the state courts, Mr. Campbell's attorney, Al Lyon, said Mr. Campbell's rights were violated when he was allowed to miss the jury selection process, even though that was done at his request. Mr. Lyon also argued that Mr. Campbell must serve prior sentences before being executed and that the state's decision to have two methods of execution violates his right to religious freedom because he is forced to make a choice in his own death. On April 14, 1994, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit lifted the stay of execution. On May 3, 1994, Campbell asked the U.S. Supreme Court to put another stay on his execution, and to rule on his claim that hanging was unconstitutional, but his request went unanswered. His execution was set for May 27, 1994. Then Governor Mike Lowry was an opponent of the death penalty, but upon hearing the details of Campbell's crimes, he refused to commute his sentence to life in prison. 24 hours before the execution, Campbell was given his last shower. His last meal was served 2 hours before the hanging took place, and he refused to eat most of it. The family members of the victims asked to watch the execution, but this request was turned down. Campbell spent his final hours talking to friends and relatives, including his ex-counselor and son. Campbell's was the second hanging in 2 years, after serial child killer Wesley Allen Dodd. Campbell refused to cooperate with the execution. He had to be moved from his cell using pepper spray, and had to be forcibly strapped to a board so that he could be hanged. Petulantly but understandably declining to get up off the floor in the run-up to his execution. It took prison officials 90 seconds to place a hood on his head and to fix the noose before the trapdoor was opened. Despite a frenzied desire to hang on to life in the run-up, when the actual time came, Campbell died without much of a struggle. An autopsy confirmed that he had died of a fracture of the cervical spine, and that his death was quick. Charles Rodman Campbell was 39 years at the time of his execution. Thank you for watching Death Row.